The distant sound of a train whistle echoed through the nearly empty station, blending with the cold breeze of the late afternoon. Sitting on a worn wooden bench, an elderly woman with silver hair gazed around with lost eyes, her breath uneven, haunted by the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. There was a void deep inside her mind, a gap where important memories should have been. Names, faces, destinations? She knew she was waiting for someone, but who exactly? That detail seemed to slip away like sand through her fingers. She clutched an old brown leather purse in her lap, her thin, wrinkled fingers smoothing the creases in the fabric, a habit she didn't even realize she had. The name embroidered on the handkerchief she held was the only thing that felt familiar. Helena. Helena. Yes, that was her name, but why was she here alone? Slowly, she turned her head, scanning the platform. The scene was indistinct, blurred by the fog in her mind. Young people hurried past, laughing, talking on their phones, completely unaware of the solitary woman sitting on the bench. A train arrived, its doors sliding open with a metallic hiss. She focused her gaze on the platform, waiting for someone, maybe a familiar face. Maybe? Nothing. The doors closed again and the train left. Helena remained alone. A silent tear rolled down her cheek. Unnoticed, deep down, something inside her knew, in the depths of her soul, that she had been left behind. A weight she couldn't explain pressed heavily on her chest. Where were her children? The face of her eldest son, Ricardo, flashed briefly in her mind, but it quickly faded away, like trying to recall a dream lost to the morning light. Suddenly, the station, once so ordinary, seemed even colder, even more cruel. Every passing second made her feel more adrift. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and the truth, painful and sharp, began to emerge slowly from the fog that clouded her thoughts. She hadn't just been forgotten, she had been abandoned. The cold air nipped at Helena's face, a biting reminder of her fragile state. She blinked, trying to focus, trying to understand. The station was still, too still. A chill crept up her spine as she struggled to make sense of her surroundings. It wasn't. The first time she felt lost like this, and it wouldn't be the last. "Ricardo?" she whispered, her voice cracking from disuse. She could picture him now, his stern face, the tightness in his jaw every time he looked at her. There had been something in his eyes lately, something she didn't quite understand, a mixture of frustration and pity. But why? As Helena strained to remember, a fleeting memory surfaced, blurry and fragmented. She was sitting at the Unauthorized dinner table, a place that once felt warm and full of life. Her 3 children were there, Ricardo, Sophia, and Lucas, their voices overlapping in an argument she couldn't follow. She remembered how Ricardo had raised his voice, the way his hands had clenched into fists. "Mom, you don't understand," Ricardo had said, his voice sharp with impatience. "We can't keep doing this." "What do you mean?" Helena had asked, her confusion deepening as she looked at the faces of her children, searching for answers. "You don't even know where you are half the time," Sophia had snapped, her eyes red from crying, exhaustion weighing heavy on her slender frame. Lucas, the youngest, had stayed silent, his gaze fixed on the table, avoiding his mother's eyes. Helena had felt small then, helpless. She had known something was wrong. The missing pieces of her memory, the growing moments of confusion. But hearing it from her children, hearing the frustration and despair in their voices, had broken something inside her. Now sitting alone on the cold bench of the train station, Helena realized that this moment had been a turning point. They had been talking about her worsening memory, about the burden she had become. "Is that why?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Was that why they left her here? She clutched the handle of her purse tighter, her knuckles white as another realization struck her. They weren't coming back. The thought was like ice water running through her veins, chilling her to the core. The people she had cared for, nurtured, and loved all her life had made a decision that left her here alone. The train station, with its flickering lights and the distant hum of trains passing by, now felt like a prison. Each passing second was a reminder that her family, the ones who should have been her safety net, had cast her aside. Had they truly thought she wouldn't remember? Or worse, had they hoped she wouldn't? Miles away from the cold train station, Ricardo sat at his kitchen table, the silence of the house pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. He stared at the untouched cup of coffee in front of him, his hands clasped together, knuckles pale from the pressure. His mind kept circling back to the same thought. Had he made the right decision? The house was quieter now, without the constant worry of his mother wandering into rooms she didn't recognize, or asking questions she'd already asked a dozen times. For the first time in months, he had the freedom to sit in his own home without the fear of finding her lost or confused, or worse, hurt. But that freedom came at a cost, the cost of abandoning his mother. Ricardo's jaw tightened as memories of the last few months washed over him. The endless doctor's appointments, the sleepless nights, and the slow, agonizing realization that his mother, the once vibrant and independent woman who had raised him, was slipping away into a world he couldn't follow. Dementia, the doctor had said. The word had hung in the air like a death sentence, a future filled with confusion, helplessness, and endless care. He had tried. God, how he had tried. But every day, it became harder to see the woman who had been his rock. Instead, there was someone else, someone fragile, someone who no longer recognized the life they had built together. His siblings hadn't made it easier. Sophia, always on edge, had broken down more times than he could count, her anger spilling out in heated arguments. "We're not equipped for this," she had shouted at him one evening, her hands trembling as she wiped away tears. "I can't do this anymore, Ricardo. She doesn't even know who we are half the time." And Lucas, the youngest, had barely spoken about it, but his silence had said everything. He couldn't handle it. The weight of their mother's illness was too much for him. It had fallen on Ricardo to make the decisions, to carry the responsibility that no one else wanted to face. But that didn't make it any easier. Ricardo's fingers trembled as he picked up the cup of coffee and brought it to his lips. The bitter liquid did nothing to soothe the knot in his stomach. He thought of the station, of the last time he had seen his mother's face. Confused, vulnerable, as she sat on the bench waiting for a train that would never come. He had told himself it was for the best, that they couldn't take care of her anymore, that the facility would eventually find her and take her in. He had convinced himself it was the only option left. But now, in the deafening quiet of his home, all he could hear was her voice, that small, shaky voice calling out his name in the way she had when he was a boy. Ricardo. He closed his eyes, trying to block it out, but the guilt was like a poison, slowly seeping into every corner of his mind. What kind of son leaves his mother alone in a train station? What kind of man walks away, knowing she wouldn't understand why? He had wanted to believe it was the right choice, but deep down, he knew. He had failed her. As the hours passed, Ricardo sat in the darkening room, the weight of his decision pressing down harder with each passing minute. He had abandoned his mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything for him, and now there was no going back. Sophia sat in her car, parked just a few streets away from her apartment. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, but she couldn't bring herself to turn the key. The engine was silent, just like the thoughts that swirled endlessly in her mind. She had dropped Ricardo off hours ago after leaving their mother at the train station, and yet she hadn't moved from this spot. Her heart felt like a stone lodged deep in her chest, heavy and immovable. She had been crying on and off for hours, her throat raw from the sobs she had tried to swallow. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion weighed her down, the kind that no amount of sleep could cure. It wasn't just physical, it was the emotional toll of watching their mother, once so strong and proud, deteriorate into someone who didn't recognize them half the time. The woman who had cooked their meals, bandaged their scraped knees, and stayed up late waiting for them to come home was gone, replaced by someone who looked like her, but wasn't her, and it broke Sophia's heart. She leaned her head back against the seat, staring at the ceiling of the car as a tear slipped down her cheek. Why had it come to this? She had never imagined this for their family. She had always thought they'd take care of each other. That family was supposed to be there in times of need, but it had become too much. The late-night phone calls from Ricardo, the constant panic that their mother had wandered off, the endless doctor appointments and specialists who all gave them the same grim news. Her memory would continue to fade until one day there would be nothing left. Sophia had tried to keep it together, to be the strong one, but she was falling apart. The arguments with Ricardo had grown more frequent, each one more heated than the last. He wanted to take on everything, control every decision. But Sophia knew he was just as lost as she was. Their brother Lucas had retreated into himself, barely speaking at all, leaving her and Ricardo to shoulder the weight of it all. But it wasn't just their mother's illness that had worn her down. It was the constant feeling of inadequacy, the belief that no matter what they did, they were failing her. Sophia felt like she was drowning under the pressure of trying to juggle her own life, her job, her own family, while also taking care of her mother. It had become impossible to do it all, and guilt had settled in her chest like a permanent ache. The guilt of thinking, just for a moment, that maybe it would be easier if their mother wasn't there. Sophia's stomach churned at the thought, disgusted with herself for even considering it, but she had. And now, as she sat alone in her car, the weight of what they had done, leaving their mother alone at that cold train station, suffocated her. She couldn't stop picturing her mother's face, that lost expression as she sat on the bench, clutching her old purse, waiting for someone to come. They weren't coming. Sophia wasn't coming. Her mother had looked so small, so fragile. Sophia had wanted to run back, to tell Ricardo they couldn't go through with it. But the fear had kept her rooted in place. Fear that they couldn't care for her anymore. Fear that she would lose everything in the process of trying to save their mother. Now, the silence in the car seemed to echo her mother's absence. The decision felt final, irreversible. She and Ricardo had made a choice, but that didn't mean she had peace with it. The tears began again, slow and unstoppable, as Sophia buried her face in her hands. She had never felt so ashamed or so alone. Lucas sat on the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the darkened screen of his phone. It had been hours since Ricardo had texted him. Just a brief message to say it was done, that their mother was at the station, Lucas had read. The words a dozen times, yet they still didn't feel real. He felt numb. The apartment around him was quiet, the stillness interrupted only by the occasional sound of traffic outside the window. But inside, his mind was anything but still. It was chaos, guilt and shame twisting together, pulling him down into a spiral he had been trying to avoid for months. He had always been the quiet one, the one who stayed in the background while his siblings argued and debated over their mother's care, Sophia's outbursts, Ricardo's controlling nature. Lucas had let them take charge because, in truth, he hadn't known what to do. He didn't know how to help their mother, didn't know how to shoulder the burden that had come crashing down on their family when her memory had begun to fade. So, he had done what he always did. He stayed silent. It was easier to keep his distance, to let Ricardo and Sophia make the decisions, easier to bury himself in work, to avoid the phone calls and the late-night visits. He had convinced himself that they had it under control, that he wasn't needed, even as the guilt gnawed at him. Every time he visited his mother, the reality of her condition hit him like a punch to the gut. The way she would smile at him, calling him by his childhood nickname, only to forget moments later who he was, the way she would ask when his father was coming home, not remembering that he had been gone for years. It broke him inside. But instead of dealing with it, Lucas had shut down. He didn't want to face it, didn't want to acknowledge that their mother was disappearing in front of them. His siblings had tried to pull him into the conversation, tried to get him to help, but every time he had withdrawn further, he didn't have the strength to confront the reality of their situation. So he had let them take over, and now the decision was made. Their mother was gone. Lucas had thought he would feel relief. He had thought that once the weight was off their shoulders, once the constant worry and stress were gone, he would feel free. But instead, he felt hollow. The image of his mother sitting on that bench, alone, waiting for them to return, haunted him. He had seen it in his mind 1,000 times since the moment Ricardo told him what they planned. To do, he hadn't said anything to stop them. That was his greatest shame. He had watched, in silence, as his siblings debated, argued, and eventually decided that abandoning their mother was the only option left. And Lucas, the one who had always been too quiet, too passive, had let it happen. Now, as he sat in the dark, he realized that the silence he had used to protect himself was suffocating him. It was too late to go back, too late to fix what they had done. He knew that no matter how much time passed, he would never forgive himself for not being stronger, for not fighting harder to keep their mother with them. The phone in his hand buzzed, but Lucas didn't look at it. He didn't need to. He knew it was another message from Ricardo or Sofia, probably asking if he was okay. He wasn't, but what could he say? That he had failed, that he had been too scared to step up when they needed him most. He didn't have the words. The station had grown darker, the evening shadows stretching across the platform as the last of the commuters hurried past. Helena shivered in the cold, pulling her thin coat tighter around her frail shoulders. She had been sitting there for what felt like hours, the minutes blurring together as the cold seeped into her bones. The faces around her were all unfamiliar, faceless blurs in a world that felt increasingly foreign. Her thoughts drifted in and out of focus, like trying to grasp the threads of a dream slipping away. Every time she thought she might remember where she was or who she was waiting for, the answer evaporated, leaving only confusion in its place. The name Ricardo echoed faintly in her mind, but the image of his face was distant, hazy. Her children's faces were like fragments of an old photograph, edges frayed and fading with time. She clutched her purse, tighter, a small comfort in a world that no longer made sense. But then, as another train pulled into the station, something stirred inside her. A face? No, a memory. She blinked, her tired eyes scanning the platform as a figure emerged from the crowd. He was tall, dressed in an old coat with a kind face lined with age. For a moment, Helena's heart raced. Did she know him? The man approached slowly, his gaze soft but cautious, as if he recognized her, but wasn't sure if she would remember him. His eyes searched hers for a flicker of recognition, a sign that she hadn't completely forgotten. "Helena?" he said, his voice gentle, hesitant, her breath caught in her throat. The name sounded so familiar on his lips, so comforting, but she couldn't place him. She stared at him, trying to piece together the fragmented memories in her mind, trying to pull his face from the fog that clouded her thoughts. There was something about him, a warmth, a familiarity that tugged at her, but it was just out of reach. I know you, don't I?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The man smiled, a sad smile that spoke of years gone by, of memories shared and lost. He nodded. "Yes, Helena, it's me, Miguel." Miguel. The name struck something deep within her. A long-forgotten memory stirred, faint but there, like the ghost of a melody. She closed her eyes, and for a brief moment, she could see him. Younger, standing in the sunlight, laughing with her in a time when everything was clear and simple. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him again. The man standing in front of her now, older, his face marked by the passage of time. He wasn't the young man in her memory, but there was no mistaking it. She knew him, or at least, She had once known him. Miguel, she repeated, the name feeling foreign yet comforting on her tongue. It's been so long. Miguel nodded, his eyes shining with emotion. Too long. He hesitated, glancing around the station before speaking again. I didn't expect to see you here. Are you waiting for someone? Helena's brow furrowed as she tried to remember. Was she waiting for someone? The thought had been clear earlier, but now, in the presence of this familiar stranger, it slipped away once more. I'm not sure, she whispered, her confusion deepening. I don't know why I'm here. Miguel's face softened with understanding. He had heard about her condition from mutual friends over the years. He knew that her memory was slipping away, piece by piece, but seeing it firsthand was different. It hurt more than he had expected. He reached out gently, his hand brushing against hers. It's all right, Helena. You're not alone anymore. Something in his words, in the warmth of his touch, made her feel safe for the first time in what felt like days, even if she couldn't remember all the details, even if she was lost in a fog of confusion. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. Miguel guided Helena gently to a quieter corner of the station, away from the rush of people. They found a bench beneath an old lamppost, its light flickering slightly, casting soft shadows on the cold pavement. As they sat down, Helena clutched her purse, the familiar weight of it grounding her in the moment. Though her mind still wandered in and out of clarity, Miguel's presence was comforting, a beacon of familiarity in the haze. He glanced at her with a mixture of concern and tenderness. The years had clearly worn on her. The once sharp mind he had known was now clouded, her eyes carrying the weight of forgotten memories. You always used to hate the cold, he said softly, hoping the casual remark would bring her back, if... Only for a moment, Helena smiled faintly, the corners of her lips twitching, as if trying to remember the warmth of that time. I did, didn't I? Her voice was distant, as if she were reaching through layers of fog to grasp at something long buried. She paused, her brow furrowing. It feels like that was a long time ago. Miguel nodded, his heart aching for her. It was, he admitted. But some things never change. Helena turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to place him, trying to anchor herself in the familiar. I remember you, she said after a long silence. But only parts. Little things? He smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. That's all right, Helena. I'm just glad I found you. She looked down at her hands, her fingers idly playing with the edge of her handkerchief. Why were you here? She asked, the question breaking through the quiet. Miguel hesitated. He hadn't planned on this meeting. He had been passing through the station, traveling for business, when he'd spotted her sitting alone, lost among the crowd. It had been sheer coincidence, or perhaps fate. Either way, seeing her there, vulnerable and alone, had stirred something inside him. He couldn't just walk away. I was on my way to a meeting, he finally said, but when I saw you, I couldn't leave without making sure you were okay. Helena, Unauthorized, smiled faintly, though the confusion lingered in her eyes. I'm glad you didn't. She paused, her voice faltering. I'm not sure where I'm supposed to be. Miguel leaned forward slightly, his expression soft but determined. Do you remember why you came here, Helena? Were you meeting someone? Her face clouded, the faint smile fading. She pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to summon the answer, but all she could find was emptiness. I don't know, she whispered. I don't remember. Miguel's concern deepened. He knew she was struggling with her memory, but seeing her like this, so disoriented, so lost, made it clear that something was very wrong. He had heard rumors from old friends about her health, but no one had told him how bad it had gotten. Helena, he said gently, have you been in touch with your children? Do they know you're here? The mention of her children brought a flicker of recognition, but it was fleeting, like a shadow slipping through her grasp, Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. Ricardo, he was always so serious, and Sophia, she worries too much, Lucas. Her voice trailed off, the names hanging in the air, but their faces remained just out of reach. The memories were there, somewhere deep inside, but they were buried beneath layers of confusion and time. Miguel frowned. It didn't make sense for her to be here, alone, in this state. Something about the situation felt off. He glanced at her again, his mind racing with questions. Where were her children? Why wasn't anyone with her? He needed to know more, but he didn't want to overwhelm her. Helena, he said softly, do you want me to call someone for you? Ricardo or Sophia, maybe? Helena froze at the question, her eyes wide with a sudden, instinctual fear. She shook her head quickly, clutching her purse tightly against her chest. No, she whispered, her voice shaky. Don't call them, please. Miguel's heart sank. Her reaction was telling. Something had happened, something that made her afraid to reach out to her own children. But why? Okay, I won't, he assured her, his voice calm and soothing. But you can trust me, Helena. Whatever's going on, I'm here to help. She nodded slowly, but the fear in her eyes remained. Miguel knew that whatever had led to this moment, it wasn't just about her memory. There was something more, something deeper, and it was tied to her children. Miguel sat in silence beside Helena, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what little she had revealed. Her fear at the mention of her children gnawed at him. He had known her family long ago when Ricardo, Sophia, and Lucas were still children, full of life and promise. Back then, Helena had been the anchor that kept them grounded. What had happened to change everything? He needed answers, and Helena, in her current state, couldn't give them to him. She sat quietly now, her fingers still fidgeting with the hem of her purse. There was a deep sadness in her eyes, as if some part of her knew what had happened, but the fog of her memory wouldn't let her grasp it fully. Miguel's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced down at it. The meeting he was supposed to attend was starting soon, but how could he go now? Helena needed him more than his work ever could. He hesitated for a moment, then made up his mind. He pulled out his phone and quickly sent a message canceling the meeting. This was more important. Turning his attention back to Helena, he spoke gently. Helena, would it be okay if I helped you get home? We can figure this out together. Helena's brow furrowed, confusion clouding her expression again. Home, she repeated softly, as if the word were foreign to her. She blinked, looking up at Miguel. I don't know where home is. Miguel's heart ached at her words. It was clear now that she was more lost than he had realized. He needed to get her somewhere safe. But first, he needed to figure out where her children were and why they weren't with her. Without letting her see, he pulled out his phone again and began searching for contact information over the sea. Years. He had kept in touch with old mutual friends, and it didn't take long to find Ricardo's number in one of his old text threads. His thumb hovered over the contact, hesitation flooding him. Should he call? Helena had clearly been terrified at the thought of reaching out to them. But what other choice did he have? Something was terribly wrong, and he needed to understand what had happened. He took a deep breath and pressed the call button. The phone rang several times before Ricardo's voice came through, clipped and weary. Hello? Miguel felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Ricardo, it's Miguel. Miguel Ortega. There was a pause, followed by a surprised exhale. Miguel? Wow, it's been a long time. What's going on? Miguel glanced at Helena, who was staring blankly ahead, unaware of the conversation. I ran into your mother today, Miguel said carefully. She's at the train station, alone. Another long silence. When Ricardo finally spoke, his voice was low, tinged with something that Miguel couldn't quite place. Was it guilt? Frustration? Yeah, Ricardo said, his tone flat. It's been difficult. Miguel's grip on the phone tightened. Difficult? Ricardo, she's disoriented. She doesn't even know where she is. How could you? Ricardo cut him off, his voice suddenly sharp. You don't understand, Miguel. We've been doing this for months, taking care of her, watching her slip away. Every day it gets worse. We couldn't handle it anymore. Miguel's heart sank as Ricardo's words hit him. He had expected to hear explanations, excuses even, but the cold truth was far more painful. They hadn't just left her by accident. This was deliberate. So you left her? Miguel's voice was tight with disbelief. Alone? At a train station? You think it was easy for us? Ricardo shot back, his voice rising with emotion. We're not monsters, Miguel. We didn't want to, but we didn't know what else to do. We've been drowning, all of us. You weren't there to see it. Miguel's chest tightened with anger and sorrow. That doesn't justify abandoning her, Ricardo. She's your mother. I know, Ricardo whispered, his voice finally breaking, revealing the guilt he had been hiding. I know. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the situation hanging heavy in the air. What about Sophia and Lucas? Miguel finally asked, hoping one of them might offer a different perspective. Ricardo sighed deeply. Sophia's a mess. She's barely holding it together, Lucas. He's not involved. Hasn't been for a while. Miguel ran a hand through his hair, the frustration mounting. This wasn't a family coping with a difficult situation. This was a family in crisis. I'm taking her somewhere safe. Miguel Staft said, his tone firm. She shouldn't be out here alone. You need to figure out what happens next. There was a pause, then a quiet, defeated, okay. Miguel ended the call and turned to Helena, who still sat in silence. She hadn't heard the conversation, hadn't reacted at all. It was as if she were in another world, a world Miguel couldn't reach, but he was determined now. Whatever had happened, whatever her children had done, he wouldn't leave her like this. He couldn't. Helena, he said softly, reaching for her hand. Let's get you somewhere warm. I'll take care of you, all right? She looked at him then, her eyes flickering with the smallest spark of trust. She nodded, just barely, and let him help her to her feet. As they walked toward the exit, Miguel knew that this was only the beginning. He had uncovered the truth, but now he had to figure out how to protect her, and how to make her family face the consequences of their actions. Miguel guided Helena through the dimly lit streets near the station, his arm gently supporting her as they walked. The air had turned colder, and Helena's frail body shivered beneath her thin coat. She moved slowly, her feet shuffling on the pavement. But she trusted him, even though her memory failed her. Some part of her recognized the kindness in his presence. We'll get you somewhere warm, Helena, Miguel said. Softly, his voice steady despite the turmoil swirling inside him. He had always been a man of action, but this situation felt different. It wasn't just about helping an old friend. It was about righting a wrong. As they reached a small cafe that stayed open late, Miguel guided her inside. The warmth of the space enveloped them, and Helena seemed to relax a little. Though her gaze remained distant, Miguel led her to a quiet corner booth, where she sank into the seat, her hands clutching her purse as though it were a lifeline. He ordered her a cup of tea and watched as she stared out of the window. Lost in her thoughts, her once bright spirit had dimmed, and it pained him to see her like this. Alone, abandoned by the very people she had dedicated her life to. How could they do this? When the tea arrived, Helena's hands trembled as she lifted the cup to her lips. Miguel watched her for a moment, then made a decision. He pulled out his phone again and sent a message to Sophia. It was time for her to confront what they had done. Back at her apartment, Sophia's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her stomach sinking when she saw Miguel's name. She had hoped the day would end in silence, that maybe the weight of their decision would fade with time. But here it was, staring her in the face. With shaking hands, she opened the message. I found your mother at the station. She's safe with me. Meet me at the coffee shop on Silver Street. We need to talk. Sophia closed her eyes, her heart racing. She had known this moment would come, but she wasn't ready. She didn't know if she would ever be ready to face what they had done, but she couldn't ignore it any longer. She grabbed her coat, hesitating for a brief moment before sending a message to Ricardo and Lucas. "We need to talk. Meet me at Silver Street. Cafe, Mom's with Miguel." Back at the cafe, Miguel glanced at his watch. He knew it wouldn't be long before they arrived. He was determined to make them understand the gravity of their actions. But he also knew it wasn't just about pointing fingers. There was too much pain in this family, too much guilt to assign to any one person. But something had to change. Helena stirred beside him, her tea untouched now, her gaze focused on something distant outside. "The window. Miguel?" she asked quietly, her voice fragile. He turned to her, leaning in closer so she wouldn't have to strain. "Yes, Helena." Her brow furrowed slightly, as if she were trying to piece something together. "Why am I here? What happened?" Miguel swallowed hard. He wanted to tell her everything. The betrayal, the abandonment, the decisions made behind closed doors. But how could he? How could he lay that burden on her when she was already struggling so much? He reached out and gently placed his hand on hers. "You're safe now," he said softly. "That's what matters." She nodded slowly, though the confusion lingered in her eyes. Miguel knew that soon the truth would come out, and it wouldn't be easy for anyone. As Sophia approached the corner booth, her eyes flickered to her mother. Helena looked so small and fragile, sitting there lost in her own thoughts. Sophia's stomach twisted with guilt, but she pushed it down, forcing herself to keep moving forward. Miguel rose to greet her, his face stern but not unkind. He didn't say anything, but the disappointment in his eyes was clear. Sophia sank into the seat across from him, feeling as if the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders. "I'm here," she said quietly, her voice strained. "What do you want me to say?" Miguel sat back down, his gaze steady on her. "I want you to see what you've done. Look at her, Sophia." He nodded toward Helena, who was still staring out of the window, her tea untouched. "She's confused. She doesn't know where she is or why she's here. You left her like this." Sophia looked at her mother, her chest tightening painfully. "You think I don't know that?" she snapped, her voice rising with emotion. "You think I haven't been living with this every single day? It's been killing me, Miguel." Miguel's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "Then why did you leave her? Why didn't you find another way?" Tears welled in Sophia's eyes, and she shook her head, her hands trembling. "Because we couldn't. I couldn't, Ricardo, Lucas, all of us. We tried, Miguel. We tried to take care of her, but it got to the point where we couldn't do it anymore. We didn't have the resources, the time, the energy. It felt like no matter what we did, we were failing." Her words hung in the air, heavy with guilt and frustration. Sophia wiped at her eyes angrily, ashamed of the tears. Miguel sighed, leaning forward. "I get that it was hard, Sophia. I do. But abandoning her at a train station wasn't the answer. She deserves better than that. She deserves care, not to be cast aside." Sophia nodded, her head bowed. "I know. God, I know that." Just then, the door of the cafe swung open again, and Ricardo entered, his face hard. With tension, he spotted Sophia and Miguel sitting with their mother and walked over, his movements stiff, as if bracing himself for the confrontation. He sat down beside Sophia, his jaw tight, his eyes avoiding Miguel's gaze. "We're here," Ricardo said, his voice low. "Let's get this over with." Miguel shook his head, the frustration rising again. "This isn't something you just get over with, Ricardo. We need to talk about what happens now. You can't just leave her like this." Ricardo let out a slow breath, rubbing his forehead. "We were going to call the facility to pick her up. That's why we left her at the station. They told us they would come, but..." His voice trailed off, guilt creeping into his words. Miguel stared at him in disbelief. "You left her at a station waiting for strangers to come take her away? She needed family, Ricardo. She needed you." Ricardo's fists clenched on the table, his voice shaking with anger and regret. Do you think we don't know that? Do you think we didn't wrestle with that decision for weeks? But what choice did we have, Miguel? It's been a nightmare every day, watching her slip away, knowing we can't stop it. We're not equipped to handle this. Helena stirred beside them, her eyes flicking between the three of them, as if sensing the tension, but not fully understanding it. Ricardo? She whispered softly, her voice fragile. Ricardo turned to her, his face crumpling at the sound of his name. Yes, Mom, I'm here. Helena smiled faintly, but there was no recognition in her eyes. It's been so long since you visited. Have you been busy? The words hit him like a punch to the gut, and Ricardo's breath caught in his throat. Busy? She didn't even realize how much time had passed, how far gone things had become. He blinked rapidly, trying to hold back the tears. That threatened to spill over. Miguel watched the exchange, his own heart heavy. This isn't just about how hard it's been on you, he said quietly. This is about her, about what she needs now. Before Ricardo could respond, the door opened once more, and Lucas stepped inside, his face pale and expression tight. He glanced around nervously before approaching the table, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation waiting for him. Without a word, he slid into the seat next to Ricardo, his eyes downcast. The tension in the air thickened as the four of them sat together, the weight of everything they had avoided now pressing down on them. Miguel looked at each of them, his voice soft but resolute. You all need to make this right. She's your mother, and whether she remembers or not, she deserves to be treated with dignity. You can't run from this anymore. Sophia wiped her eyes again, her voice breaking. We don't know what to do, Miguel. We failed her. Miguel leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. Then start by being here. Start by not abandoning her again. The silence in the cafe hung heavy, broken only by the faint clinking of dishes from the kitchen and the soft murmurs of other patrons. Around the table, Sophia, Ricardo, and Lucas sat quietly, their faces marked by exhaustion and guilt. Helena stared out of the window, lost in her thoughts. Unaware of the deep wounds that were surfacing between her children, Miguel waited, giving them space to absorb the weight of what had been said. He could see the conflict in their eyes, the struggle between the love they still had for their mother and the pain of watching her deteriorate. They had made mistakes, serious ones, but he believed it wasn't too late for them to fix this. The question now was whether they would choose to. It was Lucas who broke the silence first. He had been the quietest throughout, retreating into his own world to avoid the responsibility he knew he should have shouldered. He glanced at his siblings, then at Miguel, his voice barely above a whisper. I should have done more, he said, his eyes fixed on the table. I should have helped. I know I disappeared when you both needed me. Ricardo and Sophia turned to him, surprised by his sudden admission. They had been so caught up in their own battles, their own burdens, that they hadn't realized how deeply Lucas had been affected. His silence hadn't been indifference. It had been avoidance, a way to escape the overwhelming fear that he couldn't handle the situation. I was scared, Lucas continued, his voice trembling. I didn't know how to deal with it, watching her forget us. It was too much. But that doesn't excuse what we did. We shouldn't have left her. Sophia reached across the table and placed her hand on his, her eyes softening. None of us knew what to do, Lucas. We all made mistakes. Miguel watched as the siblings shared a moment of vulnerability, the walls between them beginning to crack. It was a small step, but it was a start. I think we all felt like we were failing her, Sophia said softly, looking at Miguel and then back to her mother. But abandoning her was the worst failure of all. Ricardo exhaled, running a hand through his hair. His usual stern expression had softened, the weight of the guilt finally breaking through his tough exterior. I thought if we handed her over to the professionals, they'd know what to do. But I see now that we should have been there, Even if it was hard, Miguel nodded, relieved to see the siblings beginning to come together. You're right. This isn't easy for anyone, but she needs you, and you can still make things right. The most important thing is that she's not left alone again. Sophia glanced at her mother, her chest tightening with emotion. We should bring her home, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We can't just leave her in a facility. She should be with family. Ricardo shifted uncomfortably. Sophia, are we really equipped to take care of her? We tried before and we couldn't handle it. Miguel leaned forward, speaking gently but firmly. It's not about doing it alone. There are services and support for families going through this. You can get help, but you can't abandon her again. You have to be present. Lucas nodded in agreement, his voice steady now. We'll figure it out together. Sophia wiped the tears from her eyes, a look of determination replacing the guilt and shame. We owe her that much. Helena stirred beside them, as if sensing the shift in the air. She looked at Miguel, then at her children, her face calm but distant. Is everything all right? She asked softly, her voice filled with the gentle confusion that had become all too familiar. Sophia smiled through her tears, taking her mother's hand. Yes, Mom. Everything's going to be all right. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the tension around the table began to ease. There was still a long road ahead, decisions to be made, plans to put in place, but the Ayat siblings had taken the first step toward healing, both for their mother and for themselves. Miguel sat back, watching them with quiet satisfaction. He had done what he could to help bring them back together, but the rest would be up to them. Family, after all, wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about finding the strength to come together when it mattered most. As they began to discuss how to bring Helena home and what kind of support they could get, Miguel felt a sense of peace settle over him. There was no perfect solution, no way to undo the past, but they were on the path to forgiveness, and that was enough. Several weeks later, Helena sat in the warmth of her home, the soft light of afternoon filtering through the curtains. She didn't remember all the details of what had happened, but there was a sense of peace in her heart. Her children visited often now, their voices no longer sharp with frustration, but filled with love and patience. Sophia had arranged for home care, ensuring that Helena had the support she needed, while Ricardo and Lucas split their time between work and spending time with their mother. They were learning to navigate this new reality together, one step at a time. Miguel still visited occasionally, his presence a steady comfort in Helena's life. She might not remember all of their shared history, but she knew that he had been there when it mattered most, and for that, she was grateful. Life wasn't perfect. It was messy, complicated, and often filled with pain. But there was also love, and as long as that remained, there was always hope.